Perfect. Hello, everyone. My name is Altea Lorenzo, and I'm the chair of the Celebrating Diversity Special Interest Group of the Royal Statistical Society, and also the secretary of the History of Statistics section of the RSS as well. This is a session jointly organized between the two groups, and we are going to tell you about the stories behind the history of women in statistics. The session is being recorded, and we welcome any questions you might have on the Q&A function. Our first speaker is Penny Reynolds, a statistician at the University of Florida whose research focuses on statistical experimental design, methodology, and sample size estimation. She's an expert on animal welfare and research reproducibility, and she's an assistant professor of anesthesiology in the College of Medicine. Apologies for the bad pronunciation. She's a member of the ASA History of Stats and also the RSS History of Statistics section. And it's my absolute pleasure to welcome her to give her presentation on well-behaved women seldom make history, or do they? So over to you, Penny. Thank you.
Start sharing. Oh, can everyone see my screen all right?
Can we see? It's not full
There.
sight yet. Perfect.
There,
Thank you.
Okay, so one of the major challenges of trying to study the history of women in statistics, or actually the history of women in general, is just the absolute lack of documentation. There's a recent novel called The Ghost in the Throat, and she talks about the erasure of a woman's life because everything that's written about her is always put in an academic context, in the context of as a satellite of some man. So in 1976, the Pulitzer Prize-winning historian Laurel Thatcher Ulrich coined the phrase, well-behaved women seldom make history. And this was promptly co-opted as a feminist slogan, showed up on T-shirts and coffee mugs and posters and ear mats and things, as a call for action for women to be more uppity, to be bloody, brave, and resolute, dare greatly, sin nobly, and all that sort of thing. But this is not what Ulrich meant at all. It's not meant to be a statement on how women ought or ought not to behave, but it's how history is presented. So her statements were that it's not only the superachievers we should celebrate, but the people doing that unheralded day-to-day work, which really changes practice and improves life for thousands, if not millions of people. But again, the problem is that it's not usually written down. So the three women I'm going to feature today, in the interest of time, I had to reduce it from 6, were the best documented of any that I've found. I'm going to briefly describe her major achievements, how they got there, the unique challenges that each one of them faced, and why their work still matters today. So the first one is Kirstine Smith, who I call the quiet genius. Contemporary reports always remark on how quiet and reserved she was. She was born in Denmark in 1878, and she's best known for inventing the field of optimal designs. Carl Pearson, who worked with her, called her his most brilliant student. So she, in a time when it was very unusual for women to go to university, or let alone major in mathematics, she got several very distinguished degrees in maths. And then after graduation, she became what was called a private secretary to Thorvald Thiele. He was a Danish mathematician, astronomer, except that his eyesight was too bad to actually do any astronomy observations. So he went full-time into statistics and actuarial science. And we don't exactly know what Smith did for him. It's unlikely to have been the somewhat pejorative idea of a secretary as passive recipient of dictation. She worked with him until his death in 1910, and at the same time, she worked as a research assistant in the International Bureau for Exploration of the Seas. Again, she published a few papers, but we don't really know what she did or what she learned then. But the watershed moment came in 1916 at the height of World War I, when she was admitted to a doctoral program at University College London. And she was ostensibly working with a Professor Hill, but she became most closely associated with Carl Pearson. She worked on statistical genetics and developed a method of partitioning the variance for sibling and parental contributions to inherited traits, still used today in evolutionary biology. She worked on a method of moments for minimizing the chi-square statistic as a criterion for goodness of fit for estimation purposes. But what was really groundbreaking was her dissertation, where she practically single-handedly developed the whole field of optimal designs, and in particular the G, or global designs. So what she did was obtain a predicted value for polynomial regressions of anything up to order 6, which was used to model the experimental space, and then minimize the maximum variance of that predicted variable. So the unique challenges she faced was, of course, that there's no computers in those days. Pearson had a mechanical calculator for his own personal use by 1910, but he didn't really start using them in his labs until later. So what Smith did was manual calculations, which took anywhere between weeks to months, cross-checked, checked, verified, and then validated with any data that there might have been. So not surprisingly, it took over 50 years, long after her death, before the importance of her work was recognized. The second thing was that she was trolled by Ronald Fisher, who was not particularly friendly to many people, and especially not to Pearson. It started off fairly benignly. He criticized the method of moments used to estimate the chi-square statistic. There's no evidence that Smith herself actually responded to him, but Pearson did, and correctly and appropriately pointed out that Fisher's arguments were not completely resolved. Fisher chose to take offense. It blew up into a major feud, which lasted for the rest of their lives. And Pearson continued to defend her against Fisher to the end of his life as well. But finally, she decided that research was not fulfilling. After her doctorate, she went back to do fisheries research, but in 1924, she left, obtained a teacher's certificate, and ended up teaching high school, which she wanted to do in order to work more closely with people, especially with adult learners. So her work matters today because it was so far ahead of her time. In 1959, she was finally recognized as the pioneer of optimal designs. The name of G-optimality was actually coined by Kiefer Wolfowitz in 59. But it took innovations and the rapid exponential growth of computational software capabilities for her methods to be more generally used. Once the technology was in place, then a wider variety of conceptual applications were possible. Drugs discovery, working within consigned design spaces, and looking at factor environments with multiple and very diverse types of factor variables, process, mixture, discrete, and that sort of thing. The second woman I want to talk about is Jessamine Whitney, described as a baseball-loving math whiz. She was born in upstate New York in 1880, and a rather gushing reporter referred to her as the ranking woman vital statistician of this country and probably of the whole world. And this was because at the time, she was an internationally recognized expert on mortality and morbidity from tuberculosis and heart disease. But interestingly enough, and this is where the reporters really tend to lose their rag, was that she was the earliest and the first woman to be a sports analyst, and specifically a baseball sabermetrician, long before those terms were even really conceptualized or thought of. She got her bachelor's, a good one, in mathematics and economics from Cornell University, and then took extra courses in actuarial science from New York University without enjoying them very much. But in 1909, she went to both the US Census Bureau and the Bureau of Labor Statistics and worked on some groundbreaking reports on infant mortality in the working poor and child labor in cotton mills. She went off to the National Tuberculosis Association, where she really made her mark. And in 1926, she was co-opted by the American Heart Association to do the sorts of reports for which she was now really well known. She was a woman of many firsts, celebrated at the time during her lifetime. She was a suffragette. She organized a lot of women's groups and chaired them herself. She was the first woman international representative at the Conference on the Classification of Causes of Disease and Death in 1929. In 1938, she was still only one of three. But in 1904, she actually became the first woman in Puerto Rico to drive a car, and she was featured in an article, 1904 article on automobiling for women. I guess it was still so uncommon. Apparently, she took to it in a matter of a day and tootled all around Puerto Rico in her little car. There's frequent newspaper coverage of her during her lifetime. The one on the left shows all the different sorts of projects that she was involved in 1914. The newspaper article on the right shows her playing with a slide rule to show how sciencey and mathy she was. But she was a real trailblazer in baseball analytics. She wrote a syndicated baseball column under the name J.S. Whitney. And she invented a unique system based on the cost of living index, which she claimed had an 80% success rate for predicting winners. She was a star athlete in college and played baseball herself. And here she is in this picture as an umpire in a 1914 charity baseball game with those awful clothes that they had to wear at the time. She still managed to get around. So the challenges she faced was, we don't really know when the transitions occurred between when she was regarded as merely a research secretary, whatever that means, to being full kudos as the chief statistician. I don't know what contributed to that transition. But the real challenge was the absolutely ferocious self-imposed work schedule she put on herself. One reporter said she was a woman who does things, and after having done them, sets about instantly about doing something others. As an international representative before air travel was common, she was always pootling around the world, talking about mortality, morbidity conferences, and she pioneered a number of studies which are still groundbreaking in their sweep and their scope. It included things not only human disease, but also labor conditions. And what was really rare for the time, especially for a woman, were studies on sex trafficking, the sex trade, and unwed mothers. So her work really matters. I think what stands out more than anything is just how passionately she was involved in projects to do with social welfare and social justice. Her report set the standard for disease reporting. Even now, the American Heart Association commends her reports for their sweep, their scope, their attention to detail. But the thing that I find most impressive is that she was meticulous in ground truthing the facts of her data by doing actual research for herself in the field. For the study of child labor in cotton mills, she became a mill hand. She worked with shop girls for a year. She stayed where they stayed, worked where they worked. She talked to sex workers, gained their trust, although she didn't actually do sex work herself, but she still nevertheless had a good idea of what the streets were like. And she became an assistant supervisor in a workhouse for unwed mothers, worked there for a year, and concluded that not only were these useless, they were also really cruel. But this was all based on her firsthand knowledge and reporting of conditions. And finally, the third one, Betty Allan, collaborative statistician. She was born in Melbourne, Australia in 1905, and pretty much revolutionized agricultural research in Australia. She's regarded as one of the founding mothers of what's now called the Commonwealth Scientific and Industrial Research Organization, or CSIRO. She was their first statistician and senior biometrical officer for 10 years between 1930 and 1940. She got a BA and an MA in mathematics at Melbourne. It won all sorts of prizes there were to be going. And then when she graduated with her master's, she won a competitive scholarship that was open to all the math graduates in Australia, beating out several hundred She also won a fellowship, which paid her way to study in the UK. Spent a year at Cambridge Newnham College with Udna Yule, studying mathematical statistics, and then at Rothamsted to learn Ronald Fisher's statistical methods in experimental design. In her summers, it also paid for her to study German at Heidelberg and visit model farms in Germany and Denmark. She wrote 3 very important papers on error estimation with John Wishart. The whole objective of this was that she could bring the cutting-edge statistical methodology to Australian agricultural research. She was very well known in Melbourne at the time. Melbourne was very proud of her and featured her in a number of newspaper articles. I don't think we'd ever seen newspaper articles like this nowadays, statistical research abroad. The challenges were, when she got back to Australia, was her workload. She was the only consultant for researchers in 6 CSIRO divisions, several hundred, plus outside agencies, and she had very heavy teaching loads. She took very seriously her responsibility to teach mathematical statistics and experimental design, not only within CSIRO itself, but also at Canberra College, which later became the Australian National University. But the biggest one was that administrators within 3 years forgot what she was actually trained for. And some of these arguments are still current today. What is the balance between consulting and doing original research as a statistician? So administrators said, well, she needs to have more publications, so she needs time for her work. And the researchers started howling, no, her work is so valuable that it would more than justify itself in the long run. And then the administrators came back with saying, well, no, the researchers are the tail that wags the dog. The efforts are too much subservient to what the researchers want. We haven't ordered them on the basis of well-defined scientific priorities. So that ding-donged for a while. The biggest dilemma was in 1940s, she got married, and the law was such that in those days, civil servants, women were not allowed to remain employed after their marriage. This law was only rescinded in 1966, but still even today, and not only in Australia, there's still some hesitation about taking on even unmarried women because they might leave to get married. So her matters not only because she was CSIRO's first statistician and the effective founder of what's made them a world-class division of mathematics and statistics, but because she showed just how important cutting-edge statistical methods and research are, and the intrinsic value of a statistical consultant as a colleague, and what statisticians can and should do to help organizations meet their goals. So finally, in conclusion, when I was doing some background reading for this, I came across this accidentally chatbot-generated definition. The statistician leader is someone who creates a vision that goes beyond the numbers. So I think in summary that all these women were true statistical leaders in that context, because even though they may not have meant to be visionary, they nevertheless, by channeling their talents, which were formidable and immense, into what really mattered to them and what made them feel passionately about it, really made a difference. And along the way, there is the unspoken non-compliance with gender norms and expectations. None of them did what women were normally expected to do. None of them accomplished what women were normally expected to accomplish. But by what they did and what they achieved, they're certainly role models for everybody, not only women, but also men. So I provided a list of references for further reading, and I'd be happy to entertain any questions.
Thanks very much, Penny. I don't. Oh, yes. So this.
Stop share.
There's a comment saying absolutely fascinating talk. I wish there were more presentations on this kind of topic. We'll have to book Penny for next year for a longer talk. Perhaps a keynote, Penny?
You're the boss, lady.
No, but that would be great. It's great to read. Thank you so much.
Yeah,
I mean,
thank you.
I will be asking you forever, Penny, but we'll probably have to take our discussion to another moment. So I'll just go quickly and introduce some of my work and I've been doing on the I'll start sharing 30. Hopefully that's visible. Yeah. Okay, so this is work I've been doing on the women's suffrage and the work of women statisticians behind it that hasn't been necessarily acknowledged in the history of statistics, and particularly the work of those that were suffragists or non-militant suffragettes. My research first started when I found the names of these two women on the stage, Millicent Garrett Fawcett standing and Eleanor Rathbone sitting. And I found their names in the records of the Royal Statistical Society. Well, they both appear amongst the first few women to be elected fellows of the society. Interestingly, I soon discovered that they had many more links and that their paths cross in more than one way. And you can see them here on the stage of the Women's Suffrage March in London in 1925. The link between science and the women's fight for vote is not completely surprising. Many of the suffragettes had a science education, and amongst major figureheads in the arts, their banners celebrated women in science, including Florence Nightingale, as you can see on the screen, but also Mary Somerville, who were both in return proud signees of their petitions of the suffrage movement. Millicent and Eleanor were both highly educated and had strong quantitative and critical skills, as well as other pioneering work in education and social care, which I don't have the time to describe here. They will take prominent roles amongst the suffrage movement in the UK. Millicent Fawcett became president of the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies in 1907. Then she will achieve in 1918 she will achieve a move in the law that will allow women that were property owners and graduates over 30 to be granted the vote. But it was only after Eleanor Rathbone succeeded her in the presidency of the National Union, which was then known as the NUSEC, in 1919, that the progress go even farther by finally getting the franchise, the Equal Franchise Act of 1928 for women over 21 to vote in England, Scotland, and Wales. Progress across the globe was very varied and progressed differently, as shown in this map. But I want to focus on the United States and how the progress was also different and followed different paths, but also had some interesting quantitative and statistical savvy women behind the movement. As you probably all well aware, in the US, the 19th Amendment ratified on August 18th of the 1920, the right to vote for white women. And finally, it wasn't until 45 years later that Black women got the right to vote. So many of those women, like those in the picture wearing the all-white dresses typical of suffragettes marches, had to publicly fight extra for the right to vote, even more than the white women had to do, and were reportedly discriminated by the mainstream white suffrage movement. Amongst those that formed part of the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs, that was called, formed in 1896 to merge a number of Black women's social clubs together, but also these suffrage platforms within the clubs. There's a prominent member of the association that was also a member of the worker at the U.S. Census Bureau and a pioneer suffragist. And she was called Gertrude Sora Darden, and she's shown in the picture. She was one of the census's first 1,605 African-American enumerators working nationwide, and she would later move on to law, but becoming the first Black woman to pass the Iowa State Bar in 1918. So it is surprising that the link of these figureheads with the wall of statistics has not been made before, and more generally, given the attention that polling statistics receive these days and the constant references to the suffrage movement in the newspapers of the time. It is surprising that not many articles covered on the topic were published before or around the time of the final women's vote success in any of the leading statistical journals. And a notable exception is this interesting article in the publications of the American Statistical Association. And it's a paper trying to address the rumor that women's suffrage was opposed by those groups in the electorate who were favorable to the continuation of the legalized manufacture and sale of alcoholic liquors, on the assumption that women would oppose to such sale. So the author, who was a sociologist, Gelke, I don't know how you pronounce that, apologies, found in this case that on the average, a neighborhood in Cuyahoga County, which was strongly for suffrage, was strongly for prohibition, for the ban of alcoholic drinks, and less strongly against license, based on analysis of data from his home county on a number of amendments to the Ohio State Constitution. So he tried to prove that these were not spurious correlations, but further research and data was required to generalize his conclusions, and he never got to do that work. So yeah, spurious or not, the potential relationship between these two movements was felt as a liability by many suffragists, and leading Ohio campaigner Harriet Taylor Upton had to publicly say, let me explain that the Suffrage Association is not a temperance organization. So to sum up very quickly, the US Census played a very prominent role in the movement over and above the essential provision of data through the work of many enumerators and other significant statisticians, fellows of the American Statistical Association, and so on. The campaigns for the women's vote in both countries, the UK and the US, involve a significant involvement of scientists and statistically minded women that haven't been necessarily recognized in the history of statistics. And above all, what these women achieved was making women count. Millicent said at one point during her fight for the vote that women were an unknown quantity, and this giving them the right to vote was the way that women actually counted. People could predict their potential votes and know more about their interests and their priorities. Finally, current research has only limited to the UK and the US, but I'm hoping to explore further. And because I'm aware that this has been quite a quick talk, I've shared some of the references. I have an article on Significance magazine, an expanded version on Chance magazine on History Chronicles edited by Penny. Thank you so much. And I also spoke on Stat Stories podcast about it, but also more information on the important aspect of Black women's right to vote that took far too long. So thank you ever so much for listening.